Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman.
That's a camera.
No, this records sound.
Okay, Sally.
Meet the Shvesters, Auntie Ruthie, Auntie Sally, and my mom, Anne.
I'm the quiet one.
And I'm the pisk.
Along with my Uncle Saul, they've been together since the 1920s. As they began to hit 100, the media started to take notice. And when the USC Shoah Foundation named them the oldest Holocaust survivor siblings in the world, I knew I needed to tell their story now.
What do you want us to?
I want
you want to ask questions?
Yes.
Okay. That's easier.
I want to talk about the war.
When the Shoah Foundation named three sisters and their brother from Sanok, Poland, the oldest surviving siblings of the Holocaust, filmmaker Allan Novak, the son of one of those sisters, realized it was time to use the footage he'd been collecting for years to tell their story. The result? Crossing the River, from Poland to Paradise, a heartwarming short documentary about how members of one family miraculously survived the Holocaust by staying together with each other and their parents. Allan is with us now to talk about his extraordinary aunts, uncle, and mom, and this equally extraordinary Holocaust story. Allan, welcome to People of the Pod.
Thank you, Manya. Great to be here.
So you had been recording interviews and kind of life with your family for decades, right? While kind of working on various other projects. But what finally moved you to make this a project?
Sure. Well, I've been filming them since I got my bar mitzvah Super 8 camera a while ago in the 70s, actually. And yeah, I've been collecting footage, at different times, was inspired to interview, to capture their story, but really more as just a kind of personal archivist kind of project. But then when the Shoah Foundation identified them as the oldest Holocaust survivor siblings in the world, as he's mentioned, I kind of posted that in my social media. And then there was a huge reaction. People just loved this idea that these people survived all this and we're still together and survived and we're thriving, in fact. And actually had a producer friend of mine inquire about were the rights available to their story. So I had to laugh because, I'm a filmmaker. So I immediately realized that somehow, my little family's story had kind of broken in a way, and it did deserve to be told and shared with the world.
So can you tell our listeners a little bit about these extraordinary family members and what your relationship with them was like growing up? When did you realize they had such an extraordinary backstory?
Well, they often talked about, Siberia, which is where they survived the war. And they were kind of small little stories. And I understood they were hungry and it was cold and that kind of a thing. But it was always kind of lighthearted and there was laughter. My Auntie Ruthie, who is prominent in the film, she was an actress in the Yiddish theater and she's really a natural comedian. And so they would make it funny. And my Uncle Saul, I call him the most positive person in the world. He actually he would look on the bright side of things. So although they went through, really tremendous trauma, somehow the way they processed it was with a positive outlook. And that kind of rubbed off on me. So I never felt, unlike the people whose parents were unfortunate enough to have been in places like Auschwitz and under the Germans, I didn't have that sort of really, really dark sense of a traumatic story, but rather kind of this sort of triumphant survivalist story. So survival is kind of the key word, and positivity together. So that's how I saw them growing up, as sort of somewhat fun, old country of uncles and aunts.
Well, now, one of the reasons your mother and most of her siblings survived is because the river that ran through Sanok also divided it into German and Russian territory. And your family fled to your great-grandparents' home on the Russian side. But about 80 of your family members stayed on the Nazi-occupied side of Sanok and were murdered. One of them was your Uncle Eli?
Yeah, Eli, yeah.
who did not stay with the siblings and parents. He had a bad feeling about where the Russians might take them. Did you ever get a sense of why the rest of the family stayed on the west side of the river in Nazi-occupied Sanok?
It's a sad thing, but part of it was economic. My grandfather had a relatively prosperous butcher shop. It was unusual because he supplied meat to the Polish military regiment there, but also to Jews. So he sort of had a half kosher, half not kosher shop, which was, I didn't even realize that could exist, but it did. He was quite Orthodox. And so they were sort of comfortable, but they shared a house, for instance, with my grandfather's brother, and he had like 9 kids. And he wasn't so successful. And so when I asked them, like, why didn't everybody go over to the other side? It's like they didn't have the money to hire a driver, horseman, get across the river. And so it was just unfortunate. And as well, it was my mother's grandmother that had the property. So on the father's side, they didn't really have that option to sort of show up on the other side of the family. So it was kind of cruel twists of family and economics. And also nobody knew, like they didn't know that that would be the right side. Nobody knew what would happen. We're talking about, the week the Germans marched into Poland in September. So, they went with their instinct, stay with the grandmother, but nobody knew what would happen. And of course, Ellie, the brother, he thought he was making the clever choice. He thought he was I'm going to survive because he didn't want to get on the train.
How old were these people when they made these decisions to stay together or stay in Sanok?
Right. So there were 5 siblings. Sally, the oldest, would have been 19. So they were like 19, 17, 15, 13, and 11. So Ellie was 11. So they stuck together. They were young, It probably seemed like a bit of an adventure, to a 13-year-old Auntie Ruthie. They didn't know, nobody knew what was to come. But Ellie was 11, and he was, by all accounts, a stubborn child and a willful kid, a tough cookie, as my Uncle Saul says. And so there's a point in the story where everybody was told, you have to get on this train by the Russians, and the family huddled together. And this 11-year-old boy, who thought he was smarter than everyone and was more willful, said, I'm not getting on that train. I'm going to stay with my grandparents, who were not being sent out. The others were deported because they were Polish citizens. And on the other side, they weren't. So that's what happened. So he was 11, strong-willed, and he made a choice. And then in the end, obviously, like one of the sort of lessons of the story is families that stay together do better than not.
As you mentioned, your family ends up in Siberia. That's where this Russian train takes them. I'll let listeners kind of watch the film to find out exactly how that unfolds. There is a story that did not make it into the film, but I read about spilled milk. And I'm hoping that you can share that story, as I think it's so sweet, but it also just gives listeners an idea of the conditions that your aunts, uncle, and mom survived.
Sure. I mean, they were living essentially in a small wooden room inside of a long wooden barrack. And every family, didn't matter how many people, you got this wooden room. There were no beds. There were just sort of boards that came down from the wall. And there was like a bucket where they would put wood in, and that's sort of all they had to kind of keep them warm. But sometimes they could do things like they could trade. There were Siberian, peasants around. And if you had an earring or something, you could get some milk, right, from a farmer nearby. And so, yeah, I think my Aunt Sally, she was able to kind of get this milk for the family. And it was this huge, huge treasure to have this small little pail of milk. And she put it under the bed for safekeeping until she could share it the next morning. And then she knocked it over in the night, and this precious, precious milk spilled on the floor. And she really, for her whole life, she just had this deep sense of regret and shame for spilling this milk, because it was just so precious to have anything to eat other than the few grams of bread they were given.
She literally cried over spilled milk for decades.
Yes.
Did her siblings know about this? And I'm just curious, what was the dynamic? You actually asked this very question in the film. You asked them, what is the dynamic between all of you? And they interpreted that as the difference. But I'm curious, just from your perspective, what was the dynamic of these siblings through the years?
Well, they came from a traditional family. The father was Orthodox, Shomer Shabbos, kosher, as probably were most of the Jews in Poland at that time in the 20s and 30s. So they had a great deal of respect for the mother and father. It would be nothing like today. It was just pure respect and love. And so between them, Sally, who's in the film, they called her the smart one. She was the most educated one. So she kind of ruled the roost in a way. But Ruth, the youngest, she was a troublemaker. She's my Auntie Ruthie, the comedian. And so she would make trouble. She would follow them. If somebody had a date, like if Sally had a date with a boy, Ruthie would be sneaking out behind and like harassing them and not going home or chasing after them. She was kind of wild and incorrigible. My mother was always the middle child. So she was the peacemaker, which you see in the film, always trying to bridge between Sally and the younger Ruth. And Saul was he was the boy, the only boy, and they really just cherished him. He was good with his hands. He could fix anything. There's a story in the film of how he had to kind of steal little parts, pieces of wood and things to end up building a cart that he could sell to get milk, that kind of thing. So they really appreciated each other, and they each had their positions, judging by birth order in a way.
You also talk in the film about how Saul and your Aunt Ruthie, they were determined to fulfill their dream of going to Israel and going to a kibbutz in Israel. Spoiler alert, they did not make it because, again, they put family first. Was this family first theme a through line of your upbringing? And also, did they ever make it to Israel as just tourists?
Yeah, family first, certainly. Yeah, I grew up with a lot of cousins, the uncles and aunts, and they all lived very close to each other for their entire adult lives. Every night, one of the uncles and aunts would be walking over down the street and sitting there. So, yeah, and we would hang with my cousins during the summer. So, yeah, family first, definitely. We were all very close with our cousins, and we still continue to be. With respect to Israel, it was really something they really wanted to be in Israel. They were part of Zionist groups called Akiba growing up. My father, this story isn't in the film, was actually the head of like a whole group of kibbutzim in Poland. And he ran the organization getting people over to Israel, in 1947, 48. And it was actually a great embarrassment to him that he ended up going with his new wife to Canada versus Israel. And he was very embarrassed because, Oscar, she and Novak, the organizer, ended up going to Canada. So it was a bit awkward, but, they went where they got their immigration and there was already family there. And just a very quick sidebar. So my father had one sister. My father lost like 9 siblings, but he had one sister who emigrated to Palestine at the time in the 20s. And she had one son. And so my only living relative in Israel was the greatest living soccer star of his era. It's the equivalent of like having Pele as your cousin. His name is Nachum Stelmach. They called him Rosh HaZahav, the golden head, because he won a famous match against Russia in the 60s. And the small country beat Russia and he won. Sidebar. So they did get to Israel. It took until the mid 60s to get there to visit his, Nahum. And then they went subsequently a few more times. But, it was expensive, particularly, in the 50s and, until the 60s. So it took until the 60s till they got there. But yeah, it was a lifelong regret, but it was just kind of the twists of fate. They might have ended up in Israel. They were on the Exodus. They were booked on the boat, the Exodus. And then my grandfather had a stroke just before. So part of the themes of the film is kind of the random twists of fate and the choices that we make. And what happens is unknowable.
The film includes footage of your mother turning 100, the birthday party, and she would always say that the best revenge against Hitler was to live long lives. What do you think has kept your family members alive for so long? What has kept them alive?
Coincidentally, Uncle Saul just had his 100th birthday party 3 days ago. Now, 3 of them hit 100 and over, and Ruthie just is going to have her 98th birthday next week. One of the things I say is they lived with intense moderation. Everything they did was moderate. They didn't eat too much. They didn't tan too much. They didn't smoke. They didn't travel. Just everything was just kind of this moderate lifestyle and exercise, right? So I believe that's part of it. They really were well preserved physically and mentally, like right to the end. And then, of course, the closeness. I think the social cohesion, that the fact that three of them moved in together to assisted living facilities, in their late 90s together, as they lived in a condo. They all had 3 apartments next to each other for 20 years as well, with Saul close by. So I think that family cohesion and closeness, and they didn't fight. They never fought, never saw a feuding moment. So, we know things like stress and all of that contribute to long lives. So I think they sort of had this mild and loving long life.
I'm sure their experience gave them some perspective. There's nothing really worth fighting about when you've survived what you did together.
Yes, absolutely right.
What has kept them so young, not so old? What lessons can we take away from the Shvesters' story today?
Certainly take care of your siblings. Stay close. Keep them close. Keep relations good. Choose togetherness over isolation when the chips are down. Positive spirit, Uncle Saul's positive spirit and their positive outlook. Again, never wallowing in what had happened to them and the things that were lost, even the family members that were lost, moving forward and cherishing what they have. And, loving your children if you have them, and the caring family gave them a lot of meaning. They did everything for us, everything for the kinder, even to the point of when the film initially premiered actually at Lincoln Center last January. And my mother was in the hospital at 100.5, and she stayed alive and alert until we had this premiere. We flew back, and then it was kind of like 3 days later, she let herself go with us there and said proper goodbyes. And I firmly believe that she just held on for the kinder, as they would say, for the children. So I think that's part of what kept them vital and youthful and alive.
Thank you so much, Allan. Thank you for making this documentary and sharing it with the world.
My complete and utter pleasure, and I hope people take as much joy and uplifting, positive, and laughter, which is ironic for film dealing with that time period, but they won. Hitler lost and they won. And so it's kind of a triumphant story. And there's a final image which people would see of them on their balcony, all around 100 in the snow in Winnipeg, holding hands, just persistent and alive, and they're together, immortalized now in the film.
Thank you so much, Allan.
My pleasure.
To watch the short film, head to the link in our show notes. If you missed our last 2 episodes, be sure to tune in for my conversations with AJC Jerusalem Director Avital Leibovich and AJC Managing Director of Policy and Political Affairs, Julie Fishman-Raymond. We talk about the high-stakes negotiations to bring the October 7th hostages home. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.